Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we're talking political personalities in the 2024 election, free speech at the Supreme Court, and ask whether New York is trying to bury itself in a quandary of unequal justice. All that and a lot more on today's special show. Pundits often dig deep into the platforms, the policies, and the scandals, but further analysis as such will not likely shed much extra light on the 2024 presidential election. The personalities, however, well, perhaps that's where the analytical gold lies buried. Now, we're fortunate to have with us today Liberty Nation's editor-in-chief, Lisa K. Donner. Thanks for being here, Lisa. It's great to have you back on.
Good to see you. How are things over in the UK?
They are fantastic. Not as exciting as the US at the moment with the presidential primary season, which is it's really become my obsession since they all started. We're recording this. There have been 6 contests so far. And I think I've had to write up a prelude and an analysis for each one. So I'm up to my eyeballs in the numbers on stuff. But what I really want to talk about today, Lisa, is actually to give me a break from the numbers. I want to talk about the personalities and what people think of the presidential candidate personality. So I guess we should start really with the most basic of basic questions. Is there a single candidate running for the 2024 presidency that is not widely disliked by a majority of the population?
Well, I guess it would have to be Nikki Haley. I mean, she is not widely liked among the MAGA people, but she does seem to enjoy some reasonable popularity among, the rank and file Democrats and Republicans, the independents, et cetera, et cetera. So it does seem like, the polls are showing she's got some kind of traction with the population in general. I don't know how significant that is. I don't know if it's real, because
I see your point there.
Let me just say something. I think people are popular when they're not really necessarily the choice, the candidate,
Yeah, they're a hypothetical, and it's much easier to be more lenient with and more accessible to an unknown quantity or a hypothetical quantity, because at the moment she's so far behind in terms of likely delegates that she's going to get that the reality of Nikki Haley, President Nikki Haley, is not really likely to come true. Although we will talk about what could happen for her in 2028. We'll talk about that later on in the show. Let's stick with the personalities for now.
Let me just say a couple of things about Nikki Haley.
Sure.
She is non-threatening to women. She is very, she's clean, neat, and articulate, I guess you would just say. She is, Hillary Clinton was sort of unlikable.
Yeah.
For whatever reason. But Nikki Haley, I think, enjoys a little more likability. Also, she's been, up until now anyway, she's been considered a strong, stable woman. I thought maybe the crying episode might cause a problem for her, but it didn't seem to.
Well, yeah, you're just to clarify that for our listeners, you're referring to, she called this press conference with a state of the presidential race press conference, presidential campaign press conference. And a lot of people, you and I weren't fooled by this. We discussed it beforehand, but a lot of people thought, she's going to fold up her tent and go home. We thought, that's not going to happen. And really all she did was call a press conference, get all the media attention and say, I'm staying in, and then began to blubber on camera. And I think the question you asked me while we were watching that in 2 separate countries, we were both watching it live. The question you asked me was, would Margaret Thatcher have ever blubbered on stage? And I thought that
your response was the Iron Lady.
Yeah, that's the Iron Lady. Never going to happen.
Unthinkable.
You're right when you say that we can draw a distinction between Nikki Haley and Hillary Clinton. Now, we're comparing them because they're 2 strong, politically involved women who are both running for president, right?
Yeah,
That's why we're making that
you can go
connection.
back to Geraldine Ferraro, but that was vice president.
Sure.
Sarah Palin. She
Yeah.
had a high unlikability factor too.
Yeah, Sarah Palin, she hasn't done much to improve that for herself in the years since either.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's something else we discussed beforehand, and it was a phrase that popped into my head that I'm desperately trying to get into any article whatsoever because I think when a good turn of phrase occurs to you, it's worth keeping and putting somewhere. And it was, and I was thinking more about power and the will to power, and I said to you that Nikki Haley, she seems to have this fatal Clinton-esque conceit in her hunt for power, as in she believes that she almost has a right to the nomination, or is that just the way I'm seeing it through my lens? What do you make of that?
Well, I think she's trying to capitalize on her strong suit, which is her popularity, among, like I was saying, independents and the middle ground, the people that can't stand Trump and can't stand Biden. I think she's just trying to capitalize on that. You got to go with what you got.
Hmm.
And, that's what she's got right now.
What
But,
she's got is she's not Trump and she's not Biden, right?
well, what's interesting about this, and I wondered if you wanted to talk about it a little bit, is there's been discussions about her being in no labels. And I don't see that happening, even though I know
Hmm.
Ari Fleischer talked about it and why he saw it happening. I don't see it happening because it would completely ruin her chances for the Republican nomination in 2028.
You know what? That really brings up the idea of motivations, as in why is she running now? Um, and the reality is, a lot of people are saying that she's just doing it to offer an alternative to Trump, or that she doesn't think Trump will do well for the party. The reality is, it seems to me that she doesn't think she can win the presidency with no labels, and she's interested in winning the presidency. It's very much yeah, it comes back to the idea of power. She wants the presidency. She has to have the presidency, and she's not going to get that with no labels, even though they have such a network in place in terms of ballot access, which is, I mean, that's a tens of millions of dollars effort to get
But
ballot
what I've
access even
looked
in a
at
single
is
state.
the reality with no labels. I just looked at this a couple of weeks ago. The
Hmm.
reality is they had the potential to be on like 20 or 30 ballots, but they were actually physically on one.
I don't think that's right. I think they have access to.
No, they have access, but
Oh,
where they're
right. I see. Yeah.
actually, what I'm saying is they have access, but where they actually are right now
Hmm.
physically is on one. But that doesn't mean, they can't get on other ones. But
Sure.
the question is, is this really true, or is this just a balloon that's being floated by somebody like Ari Fleischer?
You know what? It brings people into the no labels net. It's like if you a field of dreams. If you build it, they will come.
They will
Right?
come.
Or there's a line by one of my favorite authors, Richard Condon. It's I think it's Manchurian Candidate. It's from. Her ambition was a distressing condition. She looked for power the way a superstitious man looks for a four-leaf clover. It's something like that.
Oh, okay, that's familiar.
Um, yeah, it's Richard Condon's very, very great writer. But yeah, the idea that a no labels vehicle for Nikki Haley is there for her it's interesting, absolutely. But I don't see that it can land her the presidency, and that's what she wants, right? She wants the presidency.
Well, I think it ends up with a spoiler role,
Mm.
and we do have an independent, we can't forget, in RFK Jr.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The Ross Perot of this election, perhaps. We'll actually get onto that topic after this short break. Lisa, thanks for being here. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back in just one moment. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm still your host, Mark Angelides, and we are still joined by Liberty Nation's editor-in-chief, Lisa K. Donna. Now, Lisa and I were discussing the personalities and the projections and the motivations, to some degree, of the 2024 candidates in the first segment. But now, Lisa, thanks for coming back in. I'd really like to actually kind of carry that on a little bit. I had intended to go off on a slightly different tangent, but and talk about Nikki Haley's future ambitions. But I guess that kind of rolls into what we're doing here anyway. So we discussed that she wants to be president. I think we're both in agreement that that's what Nikki Haley is after this time. She wants the presidency, and she's going to stay in there for as long as she can, or at least until the numbers become insurmountable on Super Tuesday. But what's in the tea leaves? Let's swirl those tea leaves, or cut open some chicken gizzards. What's there for Nikki Haley should she fail to achieve the nomination this time around, which is looking more and more likely?
Well, name recognition is really important.
Yeah.
And don't get much higher name recognition than Donald J. Trump, let's face it. Joe Biden is pretty high in name recognition since he is the current president of the United States. So she gets name recognition out of this. She sucks a little bit of oxygen, political oxygen, away from both of the candidates. Not a lot, I would say, because in the primary process, it's pretty much the faithful, the tried and true that are going to come out.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, I was doing the sums on this earlier. Of the as at the time of recording, there have been 6 primaries and caucuses, and of that, Donald Trump has received 75% of the delegates so far, the Republican delegates so far.
do you know the actual number?
Well, at the time of recording, he has 129, which is 75% of the ones that have been
Okay,
cast
so
out so
Trump's
far.
got 129.
Yeah. Now, on Super Tuesday this week, there's 874 delegates available. So if we continue the 75% idea there, that puts him only 400 votes short.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
shy of
Delegates, not votes.
sorry, of delegates. Only 400 odd delegates shy of getting the nomination. So
So we know there's no path for her, really. But
after Super Tuesday, unless his delegate count collapses on Super Tuesday, there's no path forward for her. He would only have to win 32% of any delegates after Super Tuesday.
right, but it seems to me things are progressing as everyone thought.
Yes,
You know,
that's
I
exactly
mean,
right.
he's getting what everyone believed she was going to get. He's getting what everybody believed he's going to get. And now we have the changing of the guard in the Republican Party with Ronna McDaniel stepping down. That's interesting. Meanwhile, over on the other side, you got Biden and nobody really. I mean, Williamson is out, and heaven forbid, I don't even remember the name of the other
Dean
guy.
Phillips of Minnesota.
Dean
Yeah,
Phillips.
he actually scored in the recent Michigan primary for the
It was
Democrats.
like a 2% or something like
Yeah,
that.
2.7%. He actually
Yeah.
scored less than Marianne Williamson, who pulled out of the race
He
2
pulled
weeks
out of the
ago.
race. Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, Joe Biden has this locked up, assuming nothing goes wrong for him. There's no way he doesn't get that. He's the only one with delegates so far. And
Okay, so we got Biden locking it up, and we've got Trump locking it up.
yeah. So where does that leave Nikki?
So well, yeah, where's room for her? I don't know.
Are you going to be the one to say it, or shall I?
Go ahead.
2028.
Yeah,
That's where it
Yeah.
leaves her, right? 2028.
right.
I doubt she's going to get a position if Trump wins the nomination and then goes on to win the presidency. I doubt she'll get a position in his cabinet. And I suspect
But
that
she might get one in Biden's. Just kidding. Kidding.
well, that's the thing, isn't it? That's the
Or am I just kidding?
but well, who knows? That's the distinction with a difference, isn't it? So
Yeah.
if Trump wins, that will shut Nikki Haley out for 4 years. If he loses, however, does she become the de facto moral leader of the Republican Party?
Well, this is where I wonder if DeSantis may have gotten out a little too soon. DeSantis was a very strong candidate, I think, and but he couldn't see a path to victory. He was looking logically,
Yeah.
and I think she's looking a little more forward. But she didn't have the name recognition that DeSantis had. She's
Yes.
kind of got nothing to lose by continuing this
She really
charade,
doesn't.
as you would say, charade.
Charade, yeah. I mean, it is a little bit of theater, isn't it? Because to the world, she's putting out this message that I'm running to be president. I'm running because Donald Trump can't cut it, and Joe Biden is out with the fairies, as we might say, on this side of the pond. Um, but in reality, she's looking to build up to become the moral thought leader of the party. Once, if Donald Trump wins the nomination and then loses the election, to say that this MAGA wing is over, she can say. And now what we need to do is get back to 1987, essentially, which is where many of her policies seem to be coming from,
Well,
which
well,
was a
that's true.
successful time, you
But
know.
let's look at her themes. Her themes are
Sure.
kind of JFK-esque. The torch has passed to a new generation.
Mm,
She keeps going back to that theme, like these guys are too old, they're too out of it, and we need to go the way of the new generation. And I'm it. Look at me, I'm it. That's one of
yeah,
her themes.
her themes I mean, that's a great one. I love the way that you've picked that up, Lisa. I think that's really important because she's saying it's a new generation, but a lot of people who are aware of George W. Bush, who remember who that was, who, by the way, lost Michigan, was the only person.
Republicans in 1976, I think, was
Exactly, since 1976 to lose. He became president, but he lost Michigan um,
right.
twice. Twice.
Michigan is really an interesting study.
It's fantastic, isn't it?
It's, I
It's
don't
really
think, I think it's
it's
going to be the biggest swing of all swing states.
so yeah, Michigan. It's really shaping up to be a very decisive. I mean, I've been digging into the numbers here. Like we had in Michigan, we had the uncommitted vote for Joe Biden, which topped over 100,000 votes.
Yeah,
Now, sure, many of them will. They're not going to vote for Donald Trump. Those 100,000 who voted in the Democrat primary to vote
right,
uncommitted. But a
right.
couple of things out of that. One, um, Joe Biden said on the eve of the primary that we might have a ceasefire next week. I mean, he's kowtowing to a small number of voters because he's
Yeah, but
desperate
they're
to
an
get them.
important number of voters.
It is
That
important. It is
segment
important.
of Michigan is really
Oh,
high.
sure, sure.
Yeah,
Well, that's right. 100,000 votes. I think it was 150,000 that um,
that was
Biden
Trump,
won
wasn't
by.
it?
Biden won in
Um,
2020 by 150,000 votes, but
okay,
Trump won against Hillary in 2016 in Michigan by
10,000,
10,700. Yeah.
yeah.
So the thing is,
Uh,
these 100,000 who went non-committed, they're not going to they're not going to vote for Donald Trump. They might, however, stay home in bed. Lisa, your thoughts?
Well, I think it's entirely possible, but Michigan is the place to be. It's the place to watch. I suppose what happens in Israel is going to affect this, but I think these people are pretty much the Arab Americans in Michigan have pitched their tent, and Joe Biden either has to get on the wagon or get off.
Absolutely right, Lisa. What happens in Michigan stays in Michigan.
I was going to say that, but I thought it was too trite. So
Lisa
you
K.
can have
Dana,
that one.
thank you ever so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides, still with you. And we are now delving into our special Talking Liberty segment with Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, host of the excellent Uprising podcast, and a man who puts himself through Supreme Court arguments with more willingness than anyone I care to mention. Scott DeCosenza, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, Mark. My pleasure.
So, Scott, this week there was a very there are several cases in Supreme Court this week for oral arguments, but the one that I particularly want to talk about affects social media users and censorship. Now, surprisingly, this hasn't garnered a huge amount of national press, which surprises me because it is a First Amendment issue at heart, isn't it, Scott? Could you give us some details on it?
Well, this concerns the state laws that Texas and Florida passed to sort of in defense of conservatives, I think, for lack of a better way to put it, and to ensure that social media platforms didn't just willy-nilly discriminate against conservatives, deplatform them, cancel them, take their money if they were content producers without so much as a by your leave. And there are sort of many different components within those two different bodies of state laws, neither of which are being enforced presently, both of which are held up while they, this case makes its way, these two cases rather, make their way through the Supreme Court. And one thing you did mention is they're being challenged by the social media giants. So NetChoice is the name of the group that they established in order to evade and escape liability. And I meant that without a value judgment, just a data point, and press their case in the sort of the public sphere for public policy. And that's the big people of the big companies, Facebook, Google, Yahoo, you name it, the who's who of the big tech world.
And so I guess at the heart of the issue is that you have two states, Texas and Florida, and they've put together some laws that have not yet taken effect because they're being held up by different courts, and now we're at the Supreme Court, so that we're expecting some kind of resolution soon. But there's
by summer, let's
by summer, June, I believe.
On it.
Yeah.
Yes, the end of June.
So, and I think that the question at the heart of it is, should these things be in the hands of the social media companies to determine what content is allowed on the platform, or should it be kicked back to a state level ruling on what can and can't be said on a public platform? And that really comes down to, are they publishers or the opposite of a publisher, essentially just somewhere where you can post something, right? Is that what it comes down to?
So there are a couple of distinctions that we can make that might be helpful for talking about it. One is a publisher, a publisher who is actually laying out the voice of what's been said. So, for instance, when Liberty Nation publishes something, we're the voice of what's being said. It may have an author's name attached to it, but we're also responsible for it in many ways, right? But if we go to the social media accounts that we maintain on Facebook, for instance, or on Twitter, those networks would not have, those networks do not publish, strictly speaking, our messages in the legal sense. Now, literally, they're doing, they're making the ones and zeros happen, and it's their graphic interface that people are looking at when they see those words, but the words weren't put there by Mr. Musk or Mr. Zuckerberg. They were put there by the operators who have accounts there, right? Yeah. So that's what's more called a common carrier analysis. It's more like the telephone company rather than the newspaper. If that's helpful to think about. So one of the questions that the justices were wrestling with is whether these platforms are more like the newspaper or more like the phone company. Or, Mark, one of the other possibilities is maybe they're, the historical examples don't suit our current needs. Maybe there needs to be a third way going forward. But
so let me just delve in very quickly here, Scott, just to keep all the points in order. So the Supreme Court will determine whether they're acting, as you say, in one of these three ways: as a publisher, as a carrier, or as something new that has yet been done. But
they may determine them. During the oral argument, they were discussing whether those classifications were present and how to use them to craft a ruling if they wanted to. One of the things we always have to worry about, or just not worry about it, but know it's going to happen, is they may not decide to rule on those bases at all, and some other or third bases. So
if somebody determines that, for example, as you said at the beginning, this was really brought up in Texas and Florida to essentially protect conservatives, but of course protect everybody is the aim of the goal, the aim of the laws. But when a social media company censors a particular voice for viewpoint, or throttles their account, kicks them off, pulls their post, are they in fact, in layman's terms, if not in a strict legal definition, are they in fact acting as a publisher by doing so?
Well, it seems like they are, Mark.
Right.
And I think that Paul Clement is the name of the attorney that represented NetChoice and argued their case before the Supreme Court. I think what he would say is that they have a First Amendment right to curate their platforms.
Yeah.
That they are allowed to be pass-throughs of others' communication, meaning those of us who hold accounts on Twitter and Facebook, for instance, that but also they don't have to allow, for instance, the most graphic, disgusting imagery possible or words to that effect, that they can have content moderation standards and yet still enjoy the protection of Act 235 and the First Amendment, which gives them a shield from liability because they're not the author of the words that they're putting out there or the images.
The Act 235, is that the Communications Act, is it?
The Communications Decency Act, I think, is the yeah.
So I guess that really puts from a liberty perspective, it's a conundrum, isn't it? Because many liberty-minded folks are, although users of these platforms, the idea that the platforms will have a control over what an individual might say is anathema. But by the same token, from the liberty perspective here, surely there's the argument of, well, this is my company and I'll do what the hell I want. You don't have to use it. That's your liberty.
You know, Mark, I think those of us who celebrate liberty and want to continue to do so have to be mindful that what we want to have happen and what we would hope people would do don't have to comport to what we expect the law demands them of. And that the silos of civil society and what's resolved for the courts of law should be separate and distinct. And I don't want any social media platforms to discriminate against conservatives or libertarians or vaccine skeptics or whatever the latest, what is it, malinformation? Is that the term they invented to describe truthful information they'd prefer not be shared? In any case.
Yeah. There used to be a name for it. It's uncomfortable truths was what it used to be called. Yeah, now it's malinformation.
And one of the only things I think I would detest more than that is the government saying you have to do X, Y, or Z or else. And we always have to remember, Mark, no matter what we're talking about, when the government says it, it's always suffixed with or else, or rather, or else, meaning they're going to take your money. They're going to take your liberty. They're going to do something to you that only the government can do because of its monopoly on force. And for me, that always controls in any kind of remotely close call. I think we just err on the side of letting voluntary interaction handle this. And plenty of companies, people thought they could never falter and never fall. And the people voted with their feet. So.
Yeah, it's always I think it's always important to remind everybody that the First Amendment is there to constrain government. That's what it's for.
The justices struggled with this during the oral argument. They were discussing whether or not does anybody get a First Amendment protection from a private company? It seemed unresolved, but I didn't hear anything from any of the advocates that would suggest yes was somehow grounded in our legal history. So
I suspect this is going to be one of those cases that gets cited again and again and again. But as Scott, as you always point out, any expectations from the Supreme Court, the only expectation to have is expect to be disappointed.
I was just going to say I expect them to sidestep the main issues involved because of procedural problems with this case, and I expect that it won't be cited very much because it'll just be shuffled aside, and they'll say we're going to wait until next year and deal with it then. Always
a possibility. We'll be right back with Scott DiCossenza after this short break. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're back talking liberty with Scott DiCossenza here on Liberty Nation Radio. Earlier in the show, we were talking about a recent Supreme Court argument on the First Amendment. But now I want to move to a case out in New York City, Scott, with Donald Trump, of all people, because, he is dominating the legal headlines nowadays among the political.
Don't say. He's involved in some litigation?
Just a little bit, yeah. I'm sure you obviously haven't seen it. Because, it's not an important matter. But yes, Donald Trump recently just fined in New York City court $350 million plus interest owed, interest that accrues at $112,000 a day, I might add, which is, I would like to be that guy's banker, right? Yeah, whoever's receiving that. But Scott, this issue, I want to talk about it, how it reflects on New York and how it reflects on the justice system. So, if you could give us your brief, just your hot take on the verdict.
Mark, my hot take on the verdict is one that I have had for really since I started law school, probably, which is that prosecutors have far too much power and need to be reined in. And we are kind of all mad, living in a mad world if we don't do that and change the way we kind of let these people exercise their power. I've long said that prosecutors should be forbidden from seeking advanced electoral office. I think that would be a good constitutional change for a lot of states, because what we see over and over again, whether it's in Georgia with Fani Willis or in New York with Letitia James, is that prosecutors are using their the awesome power of their office not for the betterment of society or to kind of do what most people would argue is sort of a nuts and bolts law and order kind of campaign, but instead go after those who they wish to punish for political and voting reasons.
So I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head there, is that for many people, it does seem like Donald Trump is being punished for. A lot of business leaders across America have come out saying they're not going to do real estate business in New York again because Donald Trump is essentially being found liable. It is civil court, obviously, found liable for what they say what was standard business practice. But I think the question,
I think perhaps even more importantly, just to shoehorn in there, Mark, is he's being held liable to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars for something that the supposed victim of this fraud says they're not a victim of, namely a bank that he did business with who made money on loans.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite breathtaking, really, to the layman here, I guess. And I guess to as a lawyer yourself, you find it quite strange and shocking. But here's the thing: so there's 350 million plus all the interest that has to be paid. Now, here's the thing: the judge, Judge Arthur Engeron, ordered that that fine had to be paid straight away, regardless of appeal. So Donald Trump is obviously appealing. He's already launched his appeal against it, but he has to pay that regardless.
Yeah, there's a thing in the law that's called an appeal bond that is widely used, and basically companies will often try to get out of liability for any big judgment, as you might imagine, right?
Sure.
I mean, rare is the company facing a hundreds of millions of dollars in liability that says, okay, where do we send our check, please? They're all trying to escape liability. And one of the protections for quote unquote the little guy, if you will, that's implemented into law is this kind of appeal bond or posting appeal money before that it's been exhausted, so that the people are kind of likely those who have been wronged. Okay, that's who the system is set up to benefit in its contemplation, have something then to go after. Mark, all of our laws are insufficient to protect us from prosecutors who are using the law to punish their political enemies. We can't implement enough safeguards to protect us from that. We have to put in the people who will do it, because the laws will never be sufficient to protect us.
So yeah, so I've had this theory going around in my head, and I can't seem to shake it off. So I want to run it by you here, and I might be completely wrong. So listeners out there in Radio Land, take what I'm about to say with a pinch of salt, but listen carefully to Scott's answer on this. So I think the question here, Scott, and this is no doubt one that many people might be asking themselves, is whether an average citizen, somebody without wealth in the billions or even millions, if they were done an injustice by a court, and I'm not saying that Donald Trump was done an injustice by the court, but if they were and they were planning to appeal, but they're denied the ability to appeal unless they pay up first. Now, this could almost certainly, and here's the key point, this could be used to obstruct defendants from being able to exercise their right to appeal, essentially denying them a right. Now, how do you
Yeah.
square that circle, Scott? Or have I got it completely off base?
No, you have. I think that probably for you and lots of other people, they don't realize that that's what I would call stock in trade for how the Department of Justice and prosecutorial authorities go after defendants. One of the first things they'll do when they see somebody they want to go after is literally seize their bank accounts and assets so that they can't be used to mount a defense, even where there is somebody who, let's say, for instance, they allege that somebody's done something wrong in a corporate form. They almost never allege that the entirety of that person's net worth, for instance, is tied up in the criminal enterprise, right? But maybe their entire bank accounts are being seized. So
Right.
the Department of Justice and prosecutors never want a fair playing field. That is the biggest lie that's been passed over the people. They are after advantage, and they must be brought to heel by the people that hold their leash if they do. Because if they let go of that leash, which I think is what's happened in America broadly, is you get what we have, which is, you could also say it sort of on the other side, which is, I'm sure that there are plenty of people who are progressives or Democrats who don't like the idea of Ken Paxton, for instance, having the powers that he does in Texas. All of us have to fear for prosecutors who are willing to use politics to guide their choices rather than justice and the laws and sort of the people's will.
Sticking with New York, Scott, the Alvin Bragg case against Donald Trump over hush money payments. Well, in fact, it's over a paperwork violation, technically, rather than hush money payments, is coming to a head
Mark, this
soon.
is a serious state crime. I can't imagine why you would suggest otherwise.
Absolutely. But I just want to get your take on that. There's a gag order being asked for by Alvin Bragg against Donald Trump. Now,
right.
Gag orders, they seem to be de rigueur for Donald Trump, who's, he's only trying to win a presidential election. So, gag orders can't possibly hurt him politically. Your take?
Well, I'm sure this is just about the good governance of the case itself and not a political effort by Mr. Bragg to silence criticism from him. And if you can't see the sarcasm dripping from my mouth as I say that, we'll
put a red banner on this.
I was shocked to learn recently that they want to introduce the infamous Access Hollywood tape where Trump's sort of famous vulgar speech about we all know what, right?
Yeah.
And somehow that would be relevant
to a paperwork
case where
violation.
Well, this is about whether or not some money he paid was correctly accounted for.
He legally paid, was correctly accounted for.
That's the point, right? So what does this inflammatory tape have to do with anything? It's so preposterous. And I expect that the request for the gag order is simply to avoid Donald Trump's withering comments, as we know he likes to make.
I'm fairly sure that Donald Trump wishes that he'd hired an accountant now instead of managing his business enterprise all by himself. Scott DeCosenza, I want to thank you for putting up with my weird questions today.
My pleasure.
Much appreciated.
I think that the real takeaway for me is that the lawyers of America need to come up with a nice basket of something for Mr. Trump for keeping so many of us employed.
It's a full employment act, as we call it. Scott, thanks so much.
Thanks, Mark.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guests today, Liberty Nation's editor-in-chief, Lisa K. Donner, and Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and host of the excellent Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott DeCosenza, Esquire. And of course, extend my thanks to you, the listeners, for taking the time to tune in and be with us here today. You are appreciated. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are LibertyNation.com.